Good evening. If you're just joining us, we're going to give about another minute before we start with brief introductions. That way we give people a little bit of time to get signed into Zoom and ready to go. So if you can just bear with us momentarily. All right, it's just after 7 o'clock, so I'm going to start with our brief introductions and hopefully we can get people all situated and they'll be ready to go before our main event tonight. Good evening and thank you for attending the People's Law School. The People's Law School is brought to you by the Sinas Dramis Law Firm and the Michigan Association for Justice, as well as our media partner, WLNS 6. My name is Jackie Dupler. I'm an associate attorney at the Sinas Dramis Law Firm based in our Lansing office, practicing primarily family law. Tonight is the final night of People's Law School for the 2020 season, and it's definitely been quite different from years past. But I would just like to make a few comments before we get started. As a participant in the next couple of days, you will get an email probably by the end of the week that includes a survey. We do ask that you fill that survey out because we do take that into consideration for future planning, including regarding future subject areas. The format for this evening is that our presenter will speak for about an hour, taking questions throughout that you can submit through the chat feature in Zoom or through Facebook Live. You can also submit a question and we'll have someone viewing those and sending those to our speaker. At the end of the presentation, we'll have about another 10 minutes or so of additional questions. So make sure you jot those down or send those in the chat and we'll be able to ask our presenter those questions. Our speaker for this evening is Cynthia Heenan. She went to undergrad at University of Michigan and earned her Juris Doctor at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. She's the co-founder of Constitutional Litigation Associates. It's a firm that specializes in civil rights litigation, particularly police misconduct. In addition to Fourth Amendment violations, the firm has brought many cases involving the right to due process and the First Amendment. They have litigated many civil rights cases for illegal or excessive forfeiture. Something I found very interesting is that they have brought many civil rights cases on behalf of prisoners who have been denied medical care, including extreme circumstances where a Michigan Department of Corrections inmate who was kicked in the groin playing basketball was denied treatment for 5 days and ultimately lost a testicle, as well as a St. Clair County Jail inmate who was denied treatment for 26 hours after the onset of a stroke. Professionally, Ms. Heenan is involved in many organizations. She was formerly an ACLU Detroit board member, and she's currently a longtime member of the ACLU Detroit and the Michigan Lawyers Committee. In addition, she is a member of the National Lawyers Guild, serving on the local and national boards from 1999 until 2010. She is the chair of the Detroit National Lawyers Guild Civil Resistance Committee and on the steering committee of the National Lawyers Guild Mass Defense Committee. She's a founding member of the Guild's National Police Accountability Project, and she comes to all of us via Zoom. And if you could, from afar, give her a warm welcome, and we'll give it away to Ms. Heenan. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I was very excited and pleased to be invited to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is your right and my right to protest. I bring with me my Lawyers Guild hat today, since that is where my work in this area is centered. Although, as Jackie said, I've also represented individuals who have been arrested in the course of protest. So I want to tell you a little bit about, I want to tell you that I am not an expert at using share screen. Let me try that again. There we go. Okay. So the National Lawyers Guild is a radical bar association that was formed in 1937. It's the first integrated bar association in the United States. We're an organization of lawyers, legal students, legal workers, and jailhouse lawyers who function as an effective force to serve people struggling for social and economic and environmental and racial justice. Uh, One of the primary ways that we do that is through our support for demonstrations. And what we provide trainings for people about knowing your rights, and particularly with your rights to protest. And we also provide legal observers to attend demonstrations and observe and record, and if necessary, be witnesses against the activities of the police during demonstrations. We also run hotlines and help coordinate jail support and legal support for people who are arrested during protests. We provide trainings and support for people targeted by the FBI and grand juries and other forms of federal repression. And we also do work in several other areas. We have an immigration committee. We do right to shelter work. We have, of course, my National Police Accountability Project, a military law task force, and many others. So I want to apologize a little bit in advance. Afraid my partner has been ill in the hospital the last couple of weeks. He's doing much better now, but I did not have the time to prepare, so I'm afraid I don't have all the great video that I was hoping to present. AV, we called it in school, I think. So I have been active in the National Lawyers Guild in the capacity of a legal worker, a law student, and a lawyer. Hopefully I will never qualify for the jailhouse lawyer designation, but I salute those who do that work from the inside. As a member of the Mass Defense Steering Committee and the local Civil Resistance Committee, we do a lot of demonstration support, especially these days, these last 120 some days of the protests that have gone on following the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others for so long. These protesters are demanding police reforms and the dismantling of structural racism in our society. And these protests have been going on in hundreds of cities all over the country, big and small, in places where we have well-developed chapters and in places where we scramble to come to the support of activists who are oftentimes engaging in protest for their first times. So let's start at the beginning. First, we're going to talk about the source of your right to protest, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some historic protests over time in the United States and around the world. And then I'm going to give you a mini version of the Know Your Rights training that we, the Lawyers Guild, provides for protesters who are interested in defending their right to protest and making sure that they are as safe as possible on the streets. So the source of your right to protest is the First Amendment, the very first one to the Constitution of the United States. And it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. And I like to point out that of all the clauses in the First Amendment, half of them are directed to your right to protest. There's the freedom of speech, the freedom to peaceably assemble, and the freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances. In other words, to complain about stuff you don't like or that you want to see changed. There are dozens and dozens of Supreme Court cases over the centuries upholding the right to free speech and severely limiting the ability of government and government actors to interfere with our right to protest and to engage in other forms of expressive conduct or speech. When we look at the language of the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law respecting, blah, blah, blah. And how that's been interpreted and come to be understood to mean is that that police and government actors are precluded from interfering with people's First Amendment rights. The First Amendment protects all kinds of speech about every imaginable topic. The only thing it doesn't protect is immediate consent to violence. Other than that, it protects the speech, most especially that we may not like. I'm going to read to you a quote from a case called Bible Believers versus Wayne County. It says, the First Amendment offers sweeping protection that allows all manner of speech to enter the marketplace of ideas. This protection applies to loathsome and unpopular speech with the same force as it does to speech that is celebrated and widely accepted. The protection would be unnecessary if it only served to safeguard the majority of views. In fact, it is the minority view, including expressive behavior, that is deemed distasteful or highly offensive to the vast majority of people that most often needs protection under the First Amendment. And then this particular quote goes on to cite several significant Supreme Court cases, the first one being National Socialist Party of America versus the Village of Skokie. This is a 1977 case recognizing the First Amendment rights of neo-Nazis seeking to march with swastikas and to distribute racist and anti-Semitic propaganda in a predominantly Jewish community. Next is Brandenburg versus Ohio, recognizing the First Amendment rights of the Ku Klux Klan members to advocate for white supremacy-based political reform achieved through violent means. And then Texas v. Johnson, a 1989 case recognizing flag burning as a form of political expression protected by the First Amendment. And finally, Snyder v. Phelps, recognizing a religious sect's right to picket military funerals. These are just a few examples of the many kinds of speech that the Supreme Court has held are entitled to the protections of the First Amendment, regardless of how distasteful they might be to some of us. So although we do have the right to free speech, and it's highly protected by the courts, the courts have allowed what are called reasonable time, place, and matter restrictions to be applied to free expression in terms of in the form of protest. These requirements must be the least restrictive possible to protect public safety and other rights. The least regulated area for speech are what are called traditional public fora. That's public parks, sidewalks, and the old town square, places where people normally gather, and there are publicly owned spaces. Permits can be required for protesting in the streets and for the use of amplification, and also there can be restrictions on the hours and times or the decibel level that people are allowed to protest. Although again, these can only be restricted when it's absolutely necessary for the public safety, not just at the whim of government, and particularly not because the particular government actor imposing the restriction doesn't care for the topic of the protest. On the other hand, shopping malls can prohibit protest or any First Amendment activity like handing out leaflets because shopping malls are private. And as we discussed earlier, the First Amendment restricts or prohibits the government from restricting or interfering with speech. It doesn't apply to private property owners. So I want to talk a minute about protest history. Protests have long served as an effective tool for political, economic, and social change in the United States and around the world. It's barely touched on in our history classes. You probably heard about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech and the Boston Tea Party as if they were isolated events that just happened. Protest also doesn't tend to get a lot of media coverage, or maybe just the first few days. And when it does, for example, I recently read that the George Floyd protest had lasted about 2 weeks. And in fact, in cities all over the country and all over the world, they are still going on a daily or almost daily basis. The news media also tends to highlight looting and violence and ignore or overlook the fact that the vast majority of the protest activity is peaceful and nonviolent. In addition to the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests recently, inspired protests, and Black Lives Matter, of course, have been leaders in that. We've also recently seen armed protests in our state capitol opposing the governor's restrictions intended to limit the spread of COVID-19. And that also, of course, is protected speech. And the court has even held that people are allowed to arm themselves in those protests. There are protests going on all over the world that probably a lot of you don't know about. In Hong Kong, people are protesting, demanding independence and ends to repression from China. In the Philippines, people are protesting opposing new anti-terrorism laws, which will curtail free speech and give police additional arrest and surveillance powers. In Brazil, people are protesting police brutality and government corruption. And in Chile, they're protesting, like in Lansing, COVID lockdown and food shortages. And so probably the quintessential original American protest is the Boston Tea Party, conducted by colonists frustrated by taxation by Britain without representation or participation in the government. This was the first major act of defiance to British rule, and there were copycat tea dumping demonstrations, again in Massachusetts, as well as in Maryland, New York, and South Carolina. And again, these are the ongoing protests and the movement building protests that I mentioned are frequently not covered in the media or in our traditional education. So these tea parties eventually led to the First Continental Congress, in which colonial leaders decided, despite their disagreements on the tea dumping protest because some thought that was great and some thought that that was not the right approach. They agreed that they all wanted independence from British rule. The fight for independence, of course, played out through the American Revolution, and the rest is history. In the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. was held the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. But the 19th Amendment, which was passed 100 years ago this year, in 1920, giving women the right to vote, was really the result of 60 years of women and some men speaking, rallying, marching, building a movement town by town and talk by talk, sign by sign and letter by letter all over the country. And of course, we all know about the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. That march was attended by more than 250,000 people in 1963, and it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, to protest the challenges and inequalities African Americans still faced even a century after emancipation. The March on Washington eventually led to passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in fact, the Civil Rights Act had been around since the 1860s, and that's the act under which I do most of my litigating. But it had no teeth prior to 1964. At that time, it was amended to empower lawyers like me to be private attorney generals to enforce constitutional rights by providing that governments who were found liable of violating individuals' rights had to pay their attorney's fees. But Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech was not an isolated incident. That moment built on years and years of activism, and much of it protected by the First Amendment. Many of you probably know about the march in Selma at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where protesters led by Martin Luther King and our own John Conyers and many other, John Lewis, recently departed, much respected congressman from Georgia, were beat back with batons and fire hoses and worse. There were lunch counter sit-ins, not just in a few places, but all over the South. I mean, I recently had the privilege of meeting a woman who spearheaded lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, near where I am currently living. And then there were the bus boycotts, of course, Rosa Parks. But again, she wasn't the only one, and that wasn't a random act that just happened one day when she decided to stand up, or rather sit down, for her rights. The whole civil rights movement was built on many, 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 probably hundreds of actions and protests and demonstrations for years and years and years. In fact, I just learned last night that in 1959, a few weeks before I was born, the first of 3 wade-ins were conducted by a small group of Black folks in Biloxi, Mississippi, who were demanding desegregation of the public beaches. That was repeated all over the country, and slowly and by small steps, beaches were desegregated, along with, of course, most of the rest of the country. The Stonewall riots in New York City in 1969 kicked off modern day LGBTQ equal rights movement, which recently has seen success in the Supreme Court upholding gay marriage and prohibiting employment against LGBT people. On Earth Day in 2017, roughly 100,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. in a nonpartisan rally to celebrate science and promote making policy decisions using scientific evidence, particularly on issues like climate change and public health. Like the Women's March, the March for Science was inspired by the election of President Trump. Trump, of course, had previously called climate change a hoax and promised to withdraw the US from the Paris Accord on global climate mitigation, which of course he did, and abolish anti-pollution regulations, as well as cut federal funding for numerous science and research agencies. The marches for science were held not just in Washington, but in more than 600 cities around the world on that Earth Day 1917, drawing a global attendance of more than 1 million people. After 17 people were killed and 17 more were injured when a former student opened fire on the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in April 2018, students from that school organized with school kids and their supporters all around the country to organize protests and rallies demanding gun law reform, which resulted in the enactment of some of the most sweeping gun control laws this country has ever seen. Of course, abortion has been subject to protests pro and con for decades, both initially galvanizing support for what accumulated in the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade, legalizing abortion. But then also more recently, the pendulum has swung the other way, and advocates for stricter limitations on access to abortion have been heard in the legislatures and to some degree have been upheld by the courts. One of my favorite protests are the pipeline protests. As you may know, pipelines are being built all over the country, particularly in the Northwest and the Southeast, I'd say pipelines of questionable utility and undisputably sources of environmental harm to transport gas and oil that we may or may not need from the tar sands, actually from Canada. The protest to these have been sustained. There were the Standing Rock protests in North Dakota that went on for months and months. There are tree sitters and protests here where I am in the Appalachian Mountains. And to some degree, their legal actions have been successful in stopping or halting or limiting the pipelines. Of course, internationally, protest has played a big role. We know that the independence of India from British rule was spearheaded by Gandhi and came about mostly as a result of nonviolent protest and action. There was the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989, where peaceful protests ended 41 years of one-party government in favor of a parliamentary democracy. Of course, there was Tiananmen Square in China, the Arab Spring uprisings in response to inequality, corruption, and lack of accountability by the government's political repression and demands for democracy. The first one started in Tunisia in 2011 and spread through much of the Arab world, ranging from nonviolent protests to armed rebellion. Some resulted in regime change with sitting leaders deposed, and in others, the protests are still being repressed in the form of civil wars in Syria and Yemen. And of course, one of the sort of keystones of my political awakening were the worldwide protests and boycotts that brought down apartheid in South Africa. And then, of course, there were the Berlin Wall protests, where the concrete division that had separated East and West Berlin for 28 years came down after just 2 months of public protests occurred throughout Germany. pressure to take down the wall had been growing since 1989, and the demonstrations were the final straw for the East German government. And then there were the Iraq War. Millions of people in cities around the world gathered for anti-war protests in the months leading to the invasion of Iraq, which went ahead despite their efforts in March of 2003. The biggest crowds occurred in London in conjunction with global marches organized for February 15th, when at least 1 million people assembled in what is believed to be the largest ever political demonstration in the history of the United Kingdom. Now, one form of protest that is invoked sometimes is what's known as nonviolent civil disobedience. This form of protest is not entirely protected by the First Amendment. Nonviolent civil disobedience involves deliberately violating a law to make an important point to government authorities and to the public through arrest, publicity, and trials. It's often, but not exclusively, invoked by religious individuals and leaders. A couple examples include the annual School of the Americas Watch protests in, where is School of the Americas? In Georgia, I think, and also protests at nuclear weapon sites. Recently, I think it was a year or two ago, a friend of mine's aunt was involved she's a Quaker, she was involved in a protest where they cut through a fence and poured animal blood on the side of a nuclear warhead launch missile or whatever they're called, to symbolize the potential for violent destruction of humanity that these weapons contain. My same friends, they were arrested, of course, and they were tried in federal court by a jury, and they were found guilty. And now they are in or going to be sentenced to federal prison to serve time. And it was their choice to do that, to bring attention to what they feel is a potential catastrophe for humanity if action is not taken. Before the war in Iraq, in Detroit, there was a die-in on the steps of the federal courthouse where dozens of ministers, priests, not dozens, about a dozen ministers, priests, nuns, and lay religious people who were morally opposed to the war, engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. I was my privilege and pleasure to work with them on behalf of the National Lawyers Guild Civil Resistance Committee, to spend hours with them preparing for all possible scenarios. The protest consisted of wearing black robes and climbing the steps of the courthouse at both entrances, the federal courthouse in downtown Detroit, and they laid down in front of the doors and pretended to be dead, victims of the anticipated war against Iraq, victims that, of course, were sure to be the result of that war, and in fact were. They were ordered by the police to leave, and they didn't move. And eventually, they were picked up and carried off the courthouse porch and down the courthouse steps, and then they were arrested and taken to the federal lockup. Eventually, they were released on bail. It was I wanted to say it was very much my privilege also to be a legal observer for the National Lawyers Guild to that event, to witness how the police responded to the protesters and to record and document any inappropriate police behavior. In that case, there was none. The police were respectful and they did their job without excessive force or unnecessary violence. These protesters were all released on personal recognizance. not sure if any of them were under 70 years old, or were, yeah, under 70 years old. But they had done this to make a point, and they went through public jury trials in federal court where they represented themselves, and they were all found guilty. In this case, the court refused to let them present what was called the necessity defense. But in some instances, courts have allowed the necessity defense, which is a little bit like self-defense. The idea being that, yes, the protester, broke a law, but it was necessary for me to break that law in order to stop a worse harm from happening. And in this case, the worst harm that the Iraq-Dian protesters wanted to harm, in their opinion, was the harm of hundreds, thousands of people being slaughtered in war. So, okay. So there's a question in the chat: if people are engaged in nonviolent protest to make a point against an existing law, should they appeal a conviction? And then, isn't the point lost if the protesters don't serve time? In response to the first conviction, not necessarily, because the point of the protest usually isn't to protest the particular law that's being broken. In the example I gave of the courthouse protesters, they were charged with, I think, loitering or blocking ingress and blocking access to the federal court, which is a federal misdemeanor. They weren't there to protest that law. They didn't have a problem with that law. They were there to protest what they thought was they were there to protest the upcoming or likely to be upcoming war on Iraq. And it was their perception and belief that it was so important to make a statement against the war on Iraq that it was worth breaking the law, even necessary to break the law about blocking the entrance to the courthouse, in order that they could draw attention to their opposition to the war through publicity. Of course, it was all planned in advance. The media were alerted that that would happen, and then they had public trials, which were open to the public, and where they were allowed. They didn't really have a defense to the actual charge because they had undoubtedly blocked the access to the courthouse, but they were allowed in the course of their trial to explain why they did that, and therefore to share with the public and the media their concerns about the upcoming likely invasion of Iraq. And then, isn't the point lost if they don't serve time? No, I think for the same reasons. Serving time is certainly symbolic and does make a point, but also just going through the participating in the event, the demonstration, and going through the trial are also forms of speech, ways to get their message out. And in fact, the protesters that at the Detroit courthouse were all sentenced to community service, which many of them fulfilled by being legal observers with the National Lawyers Guild at other protests. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a little mini Know Your Rights workshop. This is something that we do to help people prepare for protests. And we also do Know Your Rights presentations about other scenarios, for example, traffic stops or having the police come to your house, or the FBI, or immigration, and several other scenarios. But for tonight, I'm going to focus on our Know Your Rights for protesters. Normally, we do this as an interactive a workshop where we do some role playing and play out scenarios and practice things together. So it's a little strange for me to do this as just a speech, but here we go. So the first thing we talk about is that preparation is really important. Attending a protest can be a spontaneous action, but it's much better to put some thought and preparation into it. It's more, and when I say it's better, I mean you are more likely to maintain your safety and the safety of the other protesters if you are prepared, rather than just jump in spontaneously without any preparation or forethought. So the first thing is that you tell someone where you're going and when you expect to return, and arrange for some sort of check-in with each other so that they know that you're safely back. You want to memorize that person's number or have it written on your arm in permanent magic marker, along with any protest support hotline numbers, such as the National Lawyers Guild. In Detroit, for the current protest, we have an amazing coalition between the Lawyers Guild, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the Federal Defender's Office, the NAACP, I think, is involved, and a group called Michigan Liberation, which is providing street support to the demonstrations. That includes medics and people providing information to the protesters, and just other people besides the Guild's legal observers to be eyes on the police and the protests and to maintain safety. Also, there are often medics, street medics, to be there to assist if any protesters are injured. And in some cases, protests have organizers have marshals who are participants, but who are specially trained to protect the crowd, to block roads when streets are being crossed, and to keep everybody together. So often the National Lawyers Guild, or whatever the demonstration support coalition is, will have a hotline number that you can call if you're arrested, or if something unusual or unanticipated starts to happen during the protest. For example, the use of tear gas and batons, or instances of police kettling protesters, which is where they tell everybody to leave and then surround them, blocking the exits so that it's impossible for them to leave. So they might be trapped on a block, on a street, or in an alley. And that's referred to as kettling. And then other aspects to preparation and safety are that one should always protest with a buddy. If you came by yourself, find a buddy or a small group of people you can stick with, who can watch out for each other and keep an eye on each other, and make sure that at the end of the protest, all of you are safely to your cars or modes of transportation. It's important to eat well and hydrate before the protest. Some protests, especially the George Floyd protest recently, involve some really long marches. You should bring water and snacks. And if you take prescription medications on a daily basis, it's really important to bring a few days worth of those medications in the event that you are arrested. And if you bring prescription medications, they should always be in the bottles that they come in from the pharmacy. Otherwise, the jail won't let you bring them in, and they might not anyway, but you certainly have a better chance if you bring them in the bottles with your own name on them. Of course, good shoes are important, appropriate clothing, lots of layers. In terms of gear, of course, now we all want to wear our masks and have an extra one or two. Other things that one might consider are chemical goggles to protect your eyes in the event of tear gas or other chemical irritants, and maybe a respirator. Be sure if you bring a respirator, of course, that is to protect you from inhaling tear gas or other chemical irritants, but be sure that the respirator you have is of the type that will block out those gases, because ordinary N95 respirators that you can buy in the hardware store for use in construction projects do not block out chemical irritants. You may want to consider a helmet or a hard hat. A bike helmet or a motorcycle helmet is great. Some people have even started wearing protective gear, bulletproof vests and things like that. There's a fair amount of debate about whether or not that's good or bad, but something to consider. Another tip is to park legally, and so that your car will be there when you get back. And it's a good idea to have an extra mask and a change of clothes in your car in case your clothing or your mask get saturated with chemical irritants. Another important thing is to know your willingness to be arrested. You can think about it sort of a red, yellow, green light scenario in terms of whether or not you want to avoid arrest at all costs, whether you're perfectly prepared to get arrested, or somewhere in between where you will get arrested if you think it's necessary. Another thing to consider is there a permit? Will protesters take to the streets without a permit? Obviously, your risk or likelihood of being arrested is greater if you are in the streets without a permit. Another important tip is to make sure you have a passcode on your phone, that it not, rather than it being unlocked with a thumbprint or by facial recognition. And your passcode should have at least 8 digits. And there should also be, you should set a maximum number of attempts that can be made to get into your phone before it shuts down. This is because police can open your phone with physically open your phone using facial recognition, or force your thumb onto the button on the phone, but they cannot legally make you enter your passcode or tell them your passcode without a court order. Some people also cover their scars and tattoos and don't wear any obvious or recognizable jewelry to make it more difficult to identify them, make it more difficult for police or government agents to identify them with Facebook photos and other social media. Some people also use fake names while they're at the protest, even when dealing with who they assume are like-minded activists. And that's because protests can and have been infiltrated both by police and government agents, and also by members of the radical right. And there have been many instances of protesters, and particularly legal observers, being doxxed. And being doxxed is where the protester or legal observer's personal information is broadcast on social media and to other members of alt-right groups, who then harass people either in person or on social media, sometimes coming to their homes, or even if they don't come to your homes. It's extremely unsettling to have your personal information, your place of work, your school, broadcast to individuals who might threaten or do threaten your safety and security. And finally, it's important to know that there is no guarantee you won't be arrested, no matter how prepared you are. We get questions all the time from organizers wanting to know, well, Will we get arrested if we protest, you know, on the sidewalk at the entrance to the Ambassador Bridge? Or is it legal to distribute leaflets when we're uh, picketing on a sidewalk? Um, or you know, can we protest in front of this particular government building or facility without getting arrested? And although we, do our best to let them know, what the laws are, the fact of the matter is that anybody can be arrested at any time because the police have the guns and the power, and they make the ultimate decisions. You might be able to defend yourself in court if your arrest was illegal, but illegality does not stop. Illegality or unconstitutionality does not stop an arrest from happening. So when you arrive at a protest, what are we doing? It's important to locate the NLG legal observers, organizers, medics, marshals, support teams who are there. It's really important to be alert, be vigilant. Um, we say that vigilance and solidarity help us keep each other safe. It's important to be calm. We stress that it's important to monitor yourself and your own behaviors so that you're not putting others at risk. And it's also important not to police others, but just to draw your own boundaries. And if you're uncomfortable with the directions or the tactics of the group, leave. Uh, it's important to keep an eye on the police at all times, know where they are, see what they're doing, see what they're wearing, take notice of riot gear. Sometimes you won't see any riot gear at first, and then at some point in the demonstration, when they've decided to take some action, lines of police will show up in riot gear and face shields and gas masks and carrying tear gas launchers. Sorry, I was reading the chat. I'll get to it in a second. And sorry, the other thing I was going to say is if there are tear gas canisters launched, don't touch them. They're very, very hot unless you have insulated gloves. It's better to push them away with some object other than your feet, preferably. So one of the questions just asked how many times I've been arrested. Kind of ashamed to say I never have been arrested in a protest. Almost all of my colleagues in the National Lawyers Guild and on the Civil Resistance Committee are veterans of many protests and arrests, but I have not been in a situation where where that happened or where I chose to allow that to happen. So let's talk about contact with police at the protest. The first thing we tell people is don't talk to the police. They're not there to help you. And especially not when you're demonstrating against them. And you're not required to tell them anything. If you're approached by the police, the first thing to say is, am I being detained? Am I free to go? And if the answer is no, you're not being detained and you are free to go, then you should leave. Often, police will give sort of waffly answers and say, well, no, you're not being detained, but why wouldn't you stay and answer a couple of questions so I can, complete my investigation? Or why don't you want to talk to me? And the response to that is, if I'm not being detained, then I'm free to leave, and I am leaving now. Have a nice day, officer, if you want to add that last part. The police can't require you to give your name or your identification, although it may be a good idea to identify yourself if you have been arrested, because that will help you get out of jail or prison faster. Not prison, it'll help you get out of jail faster. If you are detained or arrested, then you immediately engage in your own legal self-defense by saying, I don't I don't talk to cops. I'm exercising my right to remain silent. I don't consent to search. Feel free to say those things repeatedly as many times as necessary. You don't have to explain why. You don't have to justify. Those are your rights. You have the right not to consent to a search. You have the right not to talk to police or other government agents. That's those are enshrined in other amendments to the US Constitution. Once you invoke these magic words, then, as I said, it's very important to shut up. Don't talk to the police, even if they try to provoke you. Just saying, I'm going to remain silent is invoking your right, and it's the legally safest choice of words. And it's important to say that out loud, not just be silent, but to say the words, I am invoking my right to remain silent. I'm going to remain silent. Because the other thing that you need to say repeatedly is that you want to see your lawyer. I'm going to remain silent and I want to see my lawyer. And you don't have to know the name of a lawyer. You don't have to have a lawyer's phone number. You just say, I want to see a lawyer. I'm not going to talk until I see a lawyer, or maybe not talk at all. Anytime the police ask your permission to do something, remember it's because they're not legally allowed to do it without your consent. What they want you to do is waive your rights, and you shouldn't do it. If the police ask you if they can search your bag or your belongings, say, I don't consent to a search. This is a sort of legal band-aid because the cops may still do the search, but if you're charged with a crime, then by saying I don't consent to the search may help your lawyer to get the charges thrown out because any evidence that the police obtain through an illegal search cannot be admitted in the case against you. Let's see. So the magic words are, am I free to go? I do not consent to any search. I am going to remain silent, and I want to see a lawyer. Now, what can happen if you're arrested? There are a wide range of charges that can be brought, from misdemeanors like disorderly conduct or loitering to, or even, I think loitering may be a civil infraction in Detroit and in some places. So civil infractions, misdemeanors, or even felony assaults on police and resisting. And you can't know what you're going to be charged with when you're arrested, unfortunately. Of course, your first priority if you're arrested, you might just be processed and released. Sometimes they just take photographs or names and fingerprints, or maybe even not that, and issue tickets. That's been happening. That was happening in Detroit around the George Floyd protests. They were just ticketing people and releasing them after they brought them to the jail initially, or to the hockey arena where they were processing people. Of course, your first priority at that point is getting out of jail. So you want to call the hotline number, which you have hopefully written on your arm before the protest. In that case, the Lawyers Guild and the Bail Project and Michigan Solidarity Bail Fund will be alerted. Those organizations have some funds to bail people out. And then we track you until we know that you are released from jail safely. And in many circumstances, as we are in the George Floyd protests, we can provide volunteer lawyers to represent you and the other protesters in court. And we can do so in a way that respects your goals and priorities as a movement, as activists for change. It's very important while you're in jail. Oh, and I wanted to mention that we're representing something like 200 or 250 people who have been arrested in Detroit in the George Floyd protests so far, and also people arrested in a number of other protests around the state in the wake of during the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd protests. So a couple other things while you're in jail. Don't talk to anyone about what happened. Even if it's your best friend in the jail cell with you, don't talk about the details of what happened. This is because there are cameras and jail guards and police all over the place who are listening. You may or may not know they're listening, but they can then testify against you, repeat what you said in court if any of it turns out to be damaging to you in any way. And it's also important not to, when you talk on the phone, don't tell anyone what happened at the protest. The phone calls are almost always recorded, and even some calls to lawyers, even though they theoretically aren't supposed to be. And then finally, when you get home, you should, of course, get medical treatment if needed. And if you do, tell the doctors how you were injured and by who, in other words, by the police. And if you know what department or names, of course, you want to record that. You should document your injuries with photographs and taken by someone who can be available to testify and verify when and where they took those pictures of you. You should write down everything that happened and keep it in a safe place. And in your writing, include the names of any police officers, if you were able to get them, and also any witnesses or friends or other people that did or that you believe may have seen your arrest or the violence against you. And also, if you want to note whether or not there were media, news media, and if so, if you caught the name of the outlet and whether or not there were MLG legal observers nearby. And so that is the short version of the National Lawyers Guild Know Your Rights for Protesters training. And with that, I will conclude my presentation for today. If anyone has any questions, I'd be really happy to address them. I so wish we could be having more of a conversation or a discussion, because this is there's so much to be talked about here, and it's not necessarily amenable to a lecture format. But it's been a pleasure to be here. Enjoyed talking to you all. Oh, there's a question about how did I get involved in this area of the law? It took me a long time to decide what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I had the good fortune to stumble into a job working in a law office, several law offices actually, with some really cool progressive lawyers who were very much people lawyers. They did both criminal defense and civil work. And through them, I met my partner in law and life, Buck Davis, with whom I formed Constitutional Litigation Associates 25 years ago. And one of the reasons, well, and by that time, he has a long history with radical and progressive lawyering from the Vietnam War to the present. But at that time, he had become a specialist in police misconduct litigation. And I worked with him initially while I was still in law school. And I had known always that I wanted to do some kind of social or economic justice work. But I really saw saw a need to do this kind of work, and I felt very passionate about it. And so that's what I developed my specialty in.
Okay, everybody, Jackie Dupler here. I'm hoping we can get our participants to not be shy and they can ask a couple of questions in the chat. We're not going to say your names, so you can be anonymous. Okay, I have another question here, Cynthia. What kind of relationship do you have with local law enforcement? Is it strained because of what you do, or do you still have a good relationship because you encourage good policing?
That's interesting. Um, in some, it really depends on which police officers we're talking about. Um, uh, as most police will, at least with regard to my work, most police will at least pay lip service to the idea that it's important work, and there's a few bad apples out there that probably do need to be sued, and of course they're not one of them, but um, uh, um, they recognize that. Police chiefs will say that sort of thing. Another thing is that most of my protest support work is in Detroit, where most of my police misconduct litigation is in the suburbs and other places around the state of Michigan. Not so much Detroit. There's a couple retired police officers who went to law school and became civil rights lawyers in Detroit, and they get quite a lot of the Detroit police misconduct business, which is great. It's awesome that they're doing that. Um, uh, and it's interesting, in Detroit, compared to many places that my guild colleagues have experience with around the country, the police are relatively tolerant and even supportive of protesters. I've been legal observing in many protests where the police block the streets, and I even remember, I think it was in one of the protests opposing the invasion of Iraq. Uh, you know, we had police high-fiving the protesters and saying, "Hey, I don't want my kid fighting in that war either." Um, you know, and otherwise supporting what we're doing. When in these last months, when people have been protesting against police violence and the inequalities of the justice system, the police don't necessarily take it so well. Um, I have not had any personal involvement in that because um, my partner and I have been living out of state, so my support and work for the National Lawyers Guild is all through meetings and trainings and coordination remotely. Um, to schedule a legal observer for a protest. Um, you can contact the National Lawyers Guild. Just Google Michigan or Detroit or Michigan chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. And on our webpage, there's a link to request legal observers. And we can also, you can also request Know Your Rights trainings, um, or another thing that we do, particularly with people who are planning nonviolent civil disobedience, but with any protesters really, we will meet beforehand and answer questions people have about, uh, you know, about what what's legal and what's not legal and what they can expect to happen and how to prepare for different scenarios, just like we talked about in our little mini Know Your Rights here. Let's see, there's what type of protests generate arrest? Um, I don't think there's any particular category. As I said, I've been in numerous protests for a couple decades now in Detroit, where large numbers of people took to the streets and blocked traffic for long periods of time, and the police did nothing except for pull their cars into the intersections to block traffic to keep us safe. And yet, and most of the Black Lives Matter protests um, have not involved any police interference, but there have been about a half dozen occasions when the police came out in full riot gear and tear gassed and beat people with batons and shields and threw them to the ground and jumped on them and arrested them. And then that wasn't uh, any different than the other protests in the streets that I had encountered. And so I think there's probably a lot of things that go into that. But I think the fact that they're out there protesting the police themselves is certainly a factor. Um, there's a question about, can protests be shut down to public health concerns? Um, That's interesting. I'm not aware of any attempts to do that, although technically, if protesters aren't wearing masks, although in my experience most do, or if they're not social distancing, they could be issued civil infractions. Um, I'm not aware of government authorities attempting to cancel any protest or prohibit any protest um, in the United States because of COVID. I I don't believe there have been any court cases either. That's an interesting question. If we were in a total lockdown where people were required to stay in their homes except when it was absolutely necessary, then I think there might be an argument to be made that protests could be prohibited as a public safety measure. Um, just as being out on the streets or, going to football games can be prohibited, but I'm not aware of that happening. Um, and if anyone's interested in contacting me, my email is my last name, Heenan, Heenan, at conlitpc.com. CONLITPC.com. Happy to respond to any questions or connect you with the Lawyers Guild or other resources if you like.
Okay, I think that we are just about at time, and I think we all learned a lot. There were some really great questions from the participants, so I thank them, and of course I thank you, Cynthia. I thank MAJ, Sinas Dramis Law Firm, WLNS 6, and very important thank you to all of our participants. Thank you so much for showing up throughout the past several weeks. We obviously couldn't do this without you, so. All of you take care. Look for your email with the survey, and hopefully we'll see you back in the future. Thank you so much.